to today's lecture on the chemical coordination and integration systems of our body. This is the part 1 of the lecture, and in the next part you will hear the series will be completed. So, in the previous part of the lectures you have learnt about the neural system and how it coordinates the various organs and the entire function of the human body. Today we are going to learn about the other part of the coordinating and integrating system that is present in our body, which is the chemical coordinating system. So, what do we mean by this? So, this actually refers to what is known as the endocrine glands, and the products of these endocrine glands are called hormones. So, let me tell you a little bit more about this. Why do we need to have such a endocrine gland and hormone system as chemical coordinators in the human body? The reason is because, as you have heard about the nervous system before, although it is a very good and quick method of regulating and coordinating the multiple actions that take place throughout the human body. However, nerve fibers do not innervate all cells of the body, and because of this the cellular functions need to be continuously regulated, and many of the cells in the body in many different organs do not have a direct innervation from the nervous system. So, their cellular functions are not regulated by the nervous system. So, in order to regulate these cellular functions in different organs that are situated all over the body, you need another special kind of system. So, this special kind of system for coordination and integration is the hormonal system, and the product of the endocrine glands, which are the hormones. So, classically hormones have been defined as the product of the endocrine glands, and we will come to know about more details in today's lecture. So, as I have said before, the neural system and the endocrine system are the two arms of the coordinating system within our body, and they jointly coordinate and regulate all the physiological functions that are present in our body. So, endocrine glands, what are these? So, endocrine glands are typically known as ductless glands. What do we mean by ductless glands? So, normally many glands that you have heard of in your body have ducts. For example, the pancreas is a gland. The pancreatic duct is what is like a tube that connects the pancreatic gland to the digestive system. So, this tube is the duct through which the product of this gland can travel and enter the digestive tube. So, similarly, the endocrine glands, however, also produce hormones, but they do not secrete them through the ducts, rather they secrete them directly into the bloodstream. Hence, endocrine glands are known as ductless glands, and their secretions, as I already referred to before, are called hormones. So, I was telling you that classically hormones were defined as the product of an endocrine gland which is released into the blood and, very importantly, transported to distantly located target organs. This concept of something that is far away from the site of the gland where the hormone is produced being regulated by the hormone is what was used classically to define hormones. However, this classical definition has now been updated and it is a little bit different. It has become more broader to include many more substances that can also be called as hormones. So, the current definition of hormones are that hormones are non-nutrient chemicals which act as intercellular messengers, that is messengers between cells that communicate from one cell to the next, and are produced in trace amounts. They are not produced in huge quantities, unlike certain things like digestive enzymes. Okay. So, this current definition of the hormones is much broader, hence it covers a large number of new molecules in addition to the hormones that we already knew from the classical definition of hormones, which are secreted by organized endocrine glands. Now, invertebrate systems have very few substances that function as hormones, and whereas in vertebrates, including us humans, there are large number of chemicals which have been classified as hormones. So, let us learn then more about these hormones in more details. Since we are going to study the human endocrine system, there are several endocrine glands that produce hormones, and some of these are not glands, but they are tissues or cells located in different parts of the body which together constitute the endocrine system, and this is depicted in this diagram that I am showing you here. So, there are many different tissues and organs which come under this endocrine system, and we will discuss all of them one by one. So, you may have heard of many of these. So, the pituitary, which is situated in the brain, then the pineal gland, which is also very closely situated to the pituitary in the brain, and then you come down lower, there is in the throat, there is the thymus gland in the chest, and the thyroid and the parathyroid glands in the throat, at the beginning of the throat. And then if you go down further below, we have this huge gland called the pancreatic gland, which performs several functions that are important for digestion of food. And then on top of the two kidneys, we have this triangle shaped gland, which is called the adrenal gland. And then further down below, as part of the reproductive system, which is different in the males and the females, you have the ovary in the females and the testes in the males, which perform regulatory functions for the reproductive system. So, in addition to these classical endocrine glands that many of you might be familiar with, today's definition also includes some other organs under the endocrine system. So, what are these organs? There is the gastrointestinal tract, the liver, the kidney, the heart. They are also known to produce certain substances that communicate between cells and are produced in trace amounts. Hence, they fit into the non-classical or current definition of hormones. And we will learn about all the products of the classical endocrine system as well as the newer definition of the endocrine system in this lecture and the part 2 of the lecture, which is to follow after this. So, first we will talk about certain general characteristics of hormones and how they function. So, the types of hormones that are there, they can be classified into few different groups based on what kind of chemical composition these hormones are made up of. So, they can be divided into one class which is composed of peptides or polypeptides or longer chains, which are made up of many amino acids and are called as proteins. And the examples of these are insulin, which is produced from the pancreas, and glucagon, also produced from the pancreas, many of the pituitary hormones, and also the hypothalamic hormones. Now, I have not mentioned the hypothalamus explicitly in the previous slide, but actually the hypothalamus is a part of the brain, but it also performs endocrine functions because it secretes many hormones, which you will see in the coming slides. So, other than peptide and polypeptide and protein hormones, we also have a second type of hormones which are known as steroids. So, these steroids are different from proteins and peptides because they belong to the lipid class of macromolecules. And the examples of these are cortisol, testosterone, which is secreted from the testes, estradiol and progesterone, which are secreted from the ovaries in females. So, these are reproductive hormones as well as certain other hormones produced from the adrenal gland are called together as steroid hormones. Now, the second class was steroid hormones. The third kind is actually divided into two groups. One of these is called iodothyronines. They are derived from amino acid tyrosine, but they are distinct from the other class in that these tyrosines are modified by the addition of the iodine on them. So, these iodothyronines are what is comprises the thyroid hormones, and amino acid derivatives other than these iodothyronines are known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. These two are secreted by the adrenal medulla in the adrenal gland. So, we will learn about all of these various classes of hormones in much greater detail in the rest of this lecture. Now that you know that there are different types of hormones, let us learn about how these hormones are produced and how they are secreted from the endocrine glands. So, the polypeptide and protein hormones we will talk about first. So, these are actually produced in the endocrine glands and stored inside the cells in secretory vesicles ready to be released when needed, right. So, how does this process actually take place? So, this is a diagram of a typical eukaryotic cell and you are familiar with this. So, here is the nucleus and here is the endoplasmic reticulum with these dots which are the ribosomes for protein synthesis, and then we have the Golgi which is located here, right. And there are many smaller circles here which are called the secretory vesicles. Okay. So, most of the hormones that are polypeptide or protein in nature are the major class of hormones that are present in our body. The protein and peptide hormones are produced by transcription of genes in the nucleus, and the mRNA, when it comes out of the nucleus, it goes to what is known as the endoplasmic reticulum. And there the ribosomes which try to translate this mRNA sit on the endoplasmic reticulum, and because this is a secretory protein, it is translated, meaning protein is made from the mRNA, and this protein goes into the lumen of the endoplasmic reticulum, and there it is released. However, they are synthesized as larger proteins than the actual hormone that is secreted out of the cells. These are not biologically active, and they are called as the pre-pro hormones. Now, I will explain to you what the pre-pro term means, and what it actually means is, say this is actually the full length of the pre-pro hormone, and this is the full length of the polypeptide or protein chain that is produced. Now, there is a small part which will be cleaved out, and then this will become the pro hormone. Now, this part will be further processed and some more segments will be removed, and then this will become the final version of the hormone which is biologically active and ready to be secreted out. So, this processing of the hormone from the pre-pro version takes place partly in the endoplasmic reticulum. So, the smaller pro hormone is actually produced in the endoplasmic reticulum, and then it is secreted out of the endoplasmic reticulum in vesicles. So, these vesicles contain the pro hormone inside. Now, where do they go after this? So, after they are secreted out of the released from the endoplasmic reticulum in these vesicles carrying the pro hormone will fuse with the Golgi. You know that Golgi has 3 different parts, the cis, trans and the median Golgi, and the different parts are specialized to perform different functions. So, these vesicles will fuse with the cis part of the Golgi compartment, and there it will undergo stepwise modifications and further processing. So, what will happen? It will cleave the pro hormone into smaller biologically active version of the hormone. So, the actual final processing of the hormone is taking place in the Golgi complex, and as it goes through the various stacks of the Golgi from the cis to the trans, at the trans fate what is released out is this vesicle containing the final processed biologically active version of the hormone. Now, this hormone is stored in the cytoplasm, ready to be released when needed from the cell. This is the plasma membrane of the cell, which is a lipid bilayer, and this cytoplasmic vesicle with the hormone sometimes remains in some cases in the cytoplasm itself, or sometimes it is closely associated with the membrane, waiting for the trigger to release it. So, this trigger occurs when these secretory vesicles will then fuse with the membrane and release this. So, the trigger comes from some kind of a signal which comes from outside the cell, and this signal conveys a message into the cell, which usually leads to the increase in the levels of intracellular levels of calcium. This high level of calcium is what triggers the fusion of these vesicles with the plasma membrane. So, the vesicles are also bound by a lipid bilayer, and as they fuse with the membrane, they will release their contents out into the extracellular space, into the interstitial space, and sometimes directly into the bloodstream. So, this process is called as exocytosis, and through this secretion of protein or peptide hormones takes place. Now, let us look at steroid hormones, the other kind of hormones that we know about. So, these steroid hormones are usually synthesized from a molecule called cholesterol. which you have probably heard a lot about. This cholesterol is the normal constituent of animal cell plasma membranes, right. And these steroid hormones are not stored. So, they are synthesized as and when they are required from the precursor, which is called cholesterol, and they are released as and when required. So, this is the structure of cholesterol, and the structure of these steroid hormones, because they are derived from cholesterol, they resemble cholesterol to a large extent. And what do they look like? They are lipid soluble, because obviously cholesterol is a lipid molecule, and it consists of 3 6 carbon rings, cyclohexane rings, and 1 5 carbon cyclopentane ring. Besides this, there is an additional group attached here, and there is a hydroxyl group attached here. Now, when this cholesterol molecule undergoes a series of modifications, so different groups are attached or removed from this molecule, it results in the formation of the different kinds of steroid hormones that we will talk about later. Anyway, the large stores of cholesterol esters are present in the cytoplasm ready to be mobilized into steroid synthesis when necessary. So, when the cell that makes these hormones, these steroid hormones, receives a signal from outside that yes, you need to release these hormones into the blood, what it does, it rapidly mobilizes the stored cholesterol and synthesizes the steroid hormones that are necessary through the action of several enzymes that are involved in this pathway. And then finally, because the steroids are highly lipid soluble, they do not need to be packaged into vesicles. As they are synthesized, they can simply diffuse across the cell membrane and enter the interstitial fluid and then the blood, where they have to bind to certain proteins in order to be transported to the target organ, their destination, right. So, with this we will now move on to the third type of hormones, which are called as amino hormones. So, these amino hormones are derived from this amino acid tyrosine, and there are two kinds. One group of hormones are derived from tyrosine. The thyroid gland secretes these, and these are called the thyronins, and the other group of hormones are secreted from the adrenal medulla, and these are called as adrenal medullary hormones, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine. So, first I will talk about the tyrosine, which is turned into thyroid hormone in the thyroid gland. So, both these kinds of hormones, however, are produced from tyrosine through the action of a series of enzymes which are present in the cytoplasmic compartments of these cells. In case of thyroid hormone, it is synthesized and stored in the thyroid gland. So, if this is a cell, typical cell in the thyroid gland, it incorporates the tyrosine into it, transports it inside, and then on the other surface in the lumen, facing the lumen of the gland, you have addition of iodines to this tyrosine. So, this gives rise to two kinds of molecules, triiodothyronine or thyroxine, which has 4 iodines. So, these T3 and T4 are then again taken up back into this cell, and they are incorporated, because they are tyrosines, they are amino acids. So, they are incorporated into the synthesis of this protein, which is called as thyroglobulin. And once it is incorporated into this thyroglobulin, it is stored in that form until there is a trigger which tells the cell release the thyroid hormone. So, this then activates a peptidase which cleaves off the tyrosine residues, it cleaves off the T3 and the T4, which are then released into the bloodstream. So, in this way the thyroid hormone is released from the thyroid gland. The other class of amino hormones are also derived from the amino acid tyrosine, but they are produced by the adrenal medulla, and they are called the epinephrine molecule and the norepinephrine, which are together known as catecholamines. Okay. These catecholamines are taken up into preformed vesicles and stored until secreted. But how are they generated? So, the first step starts with tyrosine or L-tyrosine, which is an amino acid. So, a hydroxyl group is added by an enzyme which leads to formation of dihydroxyphenylalanine, just in short known as L-DOPA. So, this L-DOPA then loses a carboxyl group and it becomes dopamine. Now, this dopamine then again loses a hydroxyl group and becomes norepinephrine. Then another enzyme will add a methyl group to this and then this becomes epinephrine. So, as you can see, norepinephrine and epinephrine are both very closely related to each other. They are synthesized in the same pathway and they only differ by the addition of one methyl group. So, these are catecholamines and they are similar to protein hormones. They are stored in secretory granules. These are also released from the adrenal medullary cells by exocytosis, just like I described for the polypeptide or protein hormones. With this, we have learnt about how hormones are produced in the cells in the that form the endocrine glands and how they are released on triggering, how their release is triggered by certain stimuli which these cells receive. Then let us talk about the next part, which is the mechanism of action of these hormones. Fine, these cells are produced by the endocrine glands and they are released into the blood, then they bind to certain proteins in the blood and they are transported to all different parts of the body. Then what do? They have to act on what is known as their target organs and produce certain physiological functions. So, how does this happen? Hormones produce their effects on target tissues by binding to what is known as specific proteins which are hormone receptors. Now, I will introduce you to the concept of a receptor. So, a receptor is a molecule which is present on a particular cell which is able to recognize to and specifically bind to another molecule which is known as the ligand. So, the ligand in this case is the hormone. So, the target tissue, in other words, must contain a hormone receptor in order to become a target for that particular hormone. Now, the binding of the hormone to its receptor leads to the formation of what is known as a hormone receptor complex. So, if this is the receptor molecule which is present on the plasma membrane of the cell, the hormone comes along and it binds to the receptor specifically, it does not bind to any other protein that is present on the cell or any other cell, and together this is known as the hormone receptor complex. This receptor, as I said, specifically binds to one hormone only and hence receptors are very, very specific. Hormone receptor complex formation leads to certain biochemical changes that will occur inside the cell in the target tissue, which will be manifested as the physiological function of this hormone. So, we will look into that in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. So, how are hormone receptors then communicating this process of binding of the hormone to the surface? The first step of the hormone's action is to bind to specific receptors at the target cell. Now, I told you that cells that are targets must have receptors. Any cell that lacks receptors for this particular hormone will not be able to respond to the hormone even if the hormone is present right outside the cell. So, the locations of different hormone receptors are different depending on what kind of hormone we are talking about, and so we are going to classify them according to where the receptor is located in the cell. So, the first kind which I already described is the receptor which is located in or on the surface of the cell membrane. Usually it is a protein which is embedded into the bilayer or the plasma membrane. The membrane receptors are specific mostly for protein, peptide and catecholamine hormones. So, those hormones which are protein or peptide in nature or the catecholamine hormones have membrane bound receptors, and you have to think about why it is so, and towards the end of the lecture I will try to answer that question for you. Now, in the cell cytoplasm, so there are another class of receptors for a different type of hormone which are present in the target cell cytoplasm, not on the membrane. So, the primary receptors for different steroid hormones are found mainly in the cytoplasm. Why? Because steroid hormones can easily enter into the cell. So, once they enter into the cell, they can have the receptor in the cytoplasm. They do not need to have it on the surface of the cell in the membrane in order to detect the presence of the hormone. So, since they can enter into the cell, these receptors are found in the cytoplasm. Now, another type of intracellular receptors are also there, which are found in the cell nucleus, within the nucleus. So, this is the thyroid hormone receptor, which is found in the nucleus and is believed to be located in direct association with one or more chromosomes, meaning it is bound on the DNA and ready to go. So, in the next few slides, we will learn about what it exactly does, why is it bound to the DNA. So, let us first talk about the membrane bound receptors. So, these molecules, which are proteins mostly, they cannot enter into the cell because they are too big and they are too hydrophilic to pass through the hydrophobic bilayer, which is the membrane. So, therefore, their receptors have to be located on the cell surface and they can recognize the hormone, which does not have to enter into the cell. So, one example of such a hormone is follicle stimulating hormone. I will talk about this in the later slides, and these usually bind to the membrane receptors. The binding of the hormone triggers a change in the shape of the receptor, which activates what is known as a second messenger system. So, what is the first messenger here? The first messenger is the hormone. The hormone is bringing a message to the cell that yes, there is something to be done, okay, because of which the hormone has been produced. So, now that something has to be done has to be conveyed inside the cell. So, since the hormone cannot get in, it binds to the receptor and it conveys this message by changing the shape of the receptor, which activates a second messenger. The second messengers are usually very small molecules such as adenosine monophosphate or AMP or calcium, and we will talk a bit about the second messengers in the next slide. This second messenger activates other molecules which will convey the message further, and this leads to activation of certain proteins. Either the message is conveyed to the nucleus or within the cytoplasm itself. So, these are leading to several biochemical responses within the cytoplasm, or sometimes this leads to entry of certain proteins into the nucleus, resulting in transcription and synthesis of proteins, which will then mediate the physiological response of this hormone. So, the message from the outside of the cell has now been communicated all the way to the genes that are present within the nucleus. So, two major types of second messenger systems exist. So, there are others, but I will focus on just two most important ones. So, these are called the adenylyl cyclase cyclic AMP second messenger system or the cell membrane phospholipid second messenger system. So, I will describe each one of these one by one. So, the binding of the hormone with the receptor in this case actually activates what is known as a G protein. So, if this is the membrane bound receptor, usually the ligand comes, the hormone comes and binds to this receptor. This membrane bound receptor is associated with what is known as a G protein. So, this G protein will then activate another membrane bound enzyme, which is known as adenylyl cyclase. So, this adenylyl cyclase will catalyze the formation of a molecule called cyclic AMP. So, ATP, which you are all familiar with, is converted to cyclic AMP by this adenylyl cyclase enzyme. So, then this activates the cyclic AMP is a small molecule which can go and bind to another protein which is known as protein kinase, which is an enzyme that can add phosphate groups to other proteins. So, this protein kinase is normally in an inactive form. Only when there is cyclic AMP does it become activated, and now it can add phosphates to various other proteins and activate them in turn. Ultimately, this often results in activation of several cytoplasmic proteins or even the activation of certain nuclear proteins, which leads to gene transcription. The other second messenger system is actually involving the phospholipids which are present in the membrane. So, some hormones will activate receptors that binding of the hormone leads to activation of an enzyme called phospholipase C. This phospholipase C enzyme will act on the phospholipid that is present in the membrane itself. So, this phospholipid which is present in the membrane itself has a polar head group and it has two hydrocarbon chains which are hydrophobic in nature. So, this phospholipase C enzyme actually splits this phospholipase molecule which is PIP2 into two components, IP3 and diacylglycerol or DAG. What this IP3 does is it goes to the endoplasmic reticulum, and this endoplasmic reticulum stores a lot of calcium inside. So, IP3 binding to its receptor on the ER leads to release of this calcium from the store that is in the ER, right. Now, calcium is released in the cell and DAG is also there. So, this calcium has certain effects, it activates certain proteins, and DAG also activates another protein kinase which is known as protein kinase C. So, this protein kinase C then again catalyzes the phosphorylation of many other enzymes or proteins in the cell and leads to the cellular response of this particular hormone system. So, now we have learnt about those hormones which interact with membrane bound receptors, how they convey the message into the cell by binding to the receptor, activating second messenger systems which can be of various types, ultimately leading to modifications of several proteins by enzymes which lead to their activity and the response of the cell. Now, what about those hormones which have intracellular receptors? As I told you before, there are two kinds, steroid and thyroid hormones, which both have intracellular receptors, and they are usually present binding of these receptors to the proteins to these steroid hormones. They lead to binding to specific DNA sequences which cause gene transcription. So, the binding of the hormone to the receptor can lead to either entry of the hormone receptor complex into the nucleus, or it can change the shape of the nucleus, the receptor that is already in the nucleus, and then activate gene transcription as a result. So, both these things will lead to activation of gene transcription, and the example that is shown here is the hormone estrogen, which can get into the cell because it is a steroid. Its receptor is there in the cytoplasm, it binds to it and then enters into the nucleus, and this can then bind to specific regions or sequences within the DNA on the chromosome and activate the transcription of genes that are next to it, and this results in the formation of certain mRNAs which make certain proteins which result in the physiological response of this cell. Now, let us see what are the differences that exist between the two main types of hormones that activate gene transcription. So, this was the steroid hormone and the thyroid hormone, right. So, the steroid hormone, as I said before, its receptor is present in the cytoplasm, not in the nucleus. This binding to the hormone actually allows the hormone receptor complex to enter the nucleus. So, before this the receptor was not able to get into the nucleus. So, only on binding to the complex to the hormone can it get into the nucleus, and then it is free to bind to certain specific points on the DNA which are upstream of certain genes that are target genes of this receptor, and they lead to the transcription of these into mRNA which will then mediate the response of these cells. So, what happens here? You have the plasma membrane, this is the steroid hormone, it comes in, here is the receptor which is then binds to this. Without the hormone it was not able to get into the nucleus, but now on binding to the steroid hormone it can get into the nucleus, and on getting into the nucleus this whole complex will bind on specific sequences of DNA and then recruit the machinery for activation of gene transcription. So, an mRNA will be made which will be translated into proteins and then mediate the response of the cell. On the other hand, thyroid hormone acts very similarly, but there are a little bit of difference. So, here the receptors are present already in the nucleus. So, what do you have? You have the cell, you have the nucleus, you have the DNA, and the thyroid response genes are already bound to a receptor which is poised and ready to transcribe these genes, but it is not transcribing yet. So, what happens is, as soon as the hormone enters into the cell, it can also get into the nucleus and it binds to the receptor. Once it binds to the receptor undergoes a change in its shape. So, this change in this conformation of the receptor allows it to now activate transcription. It becomes a transcriptional activator and it transcribes the mRNA for this gene, and this is then translated into the protein and again mediates the response of the cell. The main difference is in the location of the receptor between these two, the steroid hormone and the thyroid hormone. Now, let us start with the endocrine system per se. So, the first one that we are going to talk about is the hypothalamus. So, the hypothalamus is located in the brain, as you have learnt about in the previous lectures. We talked about the neural system. So, there the hypothalamus was described to be in the diencephalon part of the brain, which is in the forebrain. So, this is a magnified image of this region. So, this is the thalamus and this is the hypothalamus, which is below it, right. So, this thalamus and the hypothalamus have also a stalk attached to them through which the pituitary gland hangs there. So, the hypothalamus is in close association with the pituitary gland. So, this hypothalamus regulates a wide spectrum of body functions through the hormones which it secretes. So, it contains several groups of neurosecretory cells. So, these are different from all the other kinds of cells that I was talking about before, which are usually not neuronal in nature. They are endocrine cells present in endocrine glands. The exception, the only exception is the hypothalamus, which has neurons that are capable of secreting hormones. Now, these hormones regulate the synthesis and secretion of pituitary hormones, as we will see in the subsequent slides. So, let us see what is the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Not only are they physically placed very close to each other, they also have a hierarchical relationship. For example, the hypothalamic hormones are required to release the hormones from the pituitary. Only when the pituitary cells receive the signal from the hypothalamus do they release their own hormones. So, what are these kinds of hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus? There are two kinds. They are known as releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. The name itself tells you what they mean. So, the releasing hormones will stimulate the secretion of pituitary hormones and the inhibiting hormones will inhibit the secretion of certain pituitary hormones. So, this is a diagrammatic representation of the hypothalamus and the closely associated pituitary gland which is there in the brain. The hypothalamic hormone, an example of this releasing hormone is the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, which is in short known as GnRH. This stimulates the pituitary gland to synthesize and release a class of hormones known as gonadotropins, while somatostatin is an example which is secreted from the hypothalamus, but belongs to the inhibitory kind of hormone which inhibits the release of the growth hormone from the pituitary gland. So, these are two examples, one of a releasing hormone and the other of an inhibiting hormone. These hormones, how are they conveyed from the hypothalamus to the pituitary? So, these hormones originate in the hypothalamic neurons. So, these are the hypothalamic neurons which produce them and they travel in membrane vesicles through the axon, come to the synapse or the end of the axon and are released here by the fusion of the vesicles to the membrane on this surface. And this is very close to certain blood vessels which are called as the portal circulatory system. So, this portal circulatory system picks up these hormones and conveys them directly to the anterior pituitary, and most of these hormones are required for releasing the hormones in the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary on the other hand is a different story. Here there are no cells themselves which release hormones, but the hypothalamic neurons of a different class have their axons terminating directly within the posterior pituitary, and they release the hormones directly within the posterior pituitary, and these then become as though they are being released from the posterior pituitary cells themselves, but they are not. They are being released from the hypothalamic neurons, and then these posterior pituitary hormones are then further taken up by the circulatory system and taken throughout the body from the posterior pituitary. Okay, let us talk about these various releasing and inhibitory hormones that control the function of the anterior pituitary gland primarily, because as I told you, the posterior gland does not have any direct secreting hormones that are produced by the posterior pituitary. So, in the anterior pituitary there are several releasing hormones which will act on the anterior pituitary. What are these? They are known as thyrotropin releasing hormone. So, all these names themselves will tell you what they do. So, this is abbreviated as TRH, which causes the release of thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH from the anterior pituitary. Then corticotropin releasing hormone or CRH causes the release of ACTH from the pituitary gland. So, here we are talking about this region of the brain and all the local activity that is taking place here. Then growth hormone releasing hormone GHRH, the name says it also causes the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. And now comes one inhibitory hormone which is called as somatostatin, which inhibits the release of growth hormone. So, growth hormone has two regulators, a releasing hormone and an inhibitory hormone, both from the hypothalamus. The fourth one is gonadotrophin releasing hormone or GnRH, which I just mentioned before. This causes the release of gonadotrophic hormones such as LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which is also known as follicle stimulating hormone, from the anterior pituitary. And last is prolactin inhibitory hormone. So, this is another example of an inhibitory hormone which causes the inhibition of prolactin secretion from the anterior pituitary. So, these are all the various releasing and inhibitory hormones that are secreted from the hypothalamus and act mostly on the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, let us now move on to the pituitary gland. So, the pituitary gland, as I said, is located just below the hypothalamus and is connected by a stalk to the hypothalamus. This is located in a bony cavity within the skull, which is called as sella turcica, and it is attached to the hypothalamus, as I just said, by a stalk. Now, it is divided into two parts. So, the part colored in darker orange here is called as the adenohypophysis, and the part colored in lighter orange here is called as the neurohypophysis. So, I have kind of explained to you what this means. So, I will not say that again. So, the adenohypophysis is the anterior pituitary and it consists of two portions. One is called as the pars distalis or the distal portion, and the other is called as the pars intermedia, which is the intermediate portion. In the human pituitary, most of these cells are actually merged together. So, it is hard to distinguish between the pars distalis and the pars intermedia. Okay. So, what are the hormones that are produced by the pars distalis? You have already kind of heard them in the context of the releasing hormones that are produced from the hypothalamus. So, the first of these is the growth hormone, which is abbreviated as GH. Second is prolactin, which is called PRL. Thyroid stimulating hormone, which is called TSH, adrenocorticotrophic hormone called ACTH, luteinizing hormone called LH, and follicle stimulating hormone abbreviated as FSH. So, these are all of the hormones that are secreted from the anterior part of the pituitary, the pars distalis part. Now, another hormone is also secreted from the anterior pituitary, the pars intermedia part, and this is called as melanocyte stimulating hormone, or it is abbreviated as MSH. Now, let us move on to the posterior part of the pituitary, and although this does not secrete hormones by itself, it has the hypothalamic axons, neurons that have their axons within the posterior pituitary, and they release two hormones which are stored in the posterior pituitary. This is oxytocin and vasopressin, which, as I said, are actually synthesized by the hypothalamus and transported axonally to the neurohypophysis. Now, let us talk about the functions of each of these pituitary hormones one by one. So, first we will talk about the hormones of the anterior pituitary, and the first among these is known as growth hormone. As the name itself suggests, growth hormone is promoting the growth of many body tissues. So, growth hormone is also called as somatotropic hormone. Soma means cell, so somatotropic means something that causes the growth of cells, or somatotropin. It is a small protein molecule, contains only 191 amino acids and all in a single chain, and has a molecular weight of about 22,000 Daltons. It causes the growth of all tissues in the body that are capable of growing at a particular time. So, if you provide with growth hormone, not all tissues are capable of growing, only those that are capable of responding to this growth hormone will respond by growing. So, what does it do to promote growth? It increases the sizes of the cells, so the cells become bigger. It increases mitosis, which is cell division or cell proliferation. So, one cell becomes two. With the development of greater number of cells and specific differentiation of certain types of cells, so these cells will not only divide and increase in number, they will also undergo this process of differentiation, which is known as specialization, so that they become specialized to perform the function that they are supposed to perform in that tissue or organ. And for example, bone growth and early muscle cells are known to respond very much to growth hormone. Now, what if you have an imbalance in these hormones? So, there are certain conditions under which you can get excessive secretion of growth hormone, and this promotes naturally abnormal growth of the body, leading to what is known as gigantism. So, you might have heard of certain people who are abnormally tall, for example, 8 feet, or I do not know what the Guinness Book of World Record is right now. So, such people are usually that tall because of excessive secretion of growth hormones. And the opposite end of the spectrum, on the other hand, is decreased secretion of growth hormones. So, this, as you may have guessed, leads to dwarfism, a particular type of dwarfism which is called pituitary dwarfism, because it is due to the growth hormone deficiency which is produced by the pituitary gland. So, now you know what the function of growth hormone is. So, the next hormone that we will talk about, also from the anterior pituitary, is prolactin. So, prolactin, as the name suggests, pro and lactin, lacto refers to milk. So, it is regulating the secretion of or production of milk in the mammary glands, and it also regulates the growth of the mammary glands themselves. So, it is to deal with reproductive functions. When the mammary glands are required to produce milk, prolactin will stimulate this process. Then we come to the next one, which is TSH. So, now we are moving down into the site of action of these hormones. So, we have already talked about prolactin, which acts on the mammary glands. Now, we are going to talk about thyroid stimulating hormone, which is produced by the anterior pituitary and acts on the thyroid gland. So, this stimulates the synthesis and secretion of thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland, and the name explains why it is called as the thyroid stimulating hormone. The next one is called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is again released from the pituitary gland, but acts on the cortex of the adrenal gland, which is situated on top of the kidneys, and this leads to the secretion of hormones called as glucocorticoids from the cortex of the adrenal gland. So, the adrenal gland has two regions. The outer region is called the cortex and the inner region is called the medulla. So, we have already heard of certain hormones that come from the medulla, remember, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and now we are talking about certain steroid hormones which are produced by the cortex. Now, the last hormone in this series is gonadotrophins, which are LH and FSH. They are 2 hormones. So, together they are called as gonadotrophins, and the name itself tells you they work on the gonads, which are the reproductive organs, the ovaries and the testes, and they function to cause several effects on the ovaries and the testes, which I am going to enumerate now. So, they have different activities in males and females. In males, the luteinizing hormone or LH stimulates the synthesis of hormones called androgens, which one of which is, you might be familiar with, testosterone from the testes. In males, FSH on the other hand stimulates the process of spermatogenesis or production of sperm in the testes. In the females, however, they have other functions. In females, the same LH induces ovulation or production of ova or egg from the ovary and release of this egg from the ovary. And then after the egg is actually released from the ovary, there is a structure that remains in the ovary, which is called the corpus luteum, CL. I will abbreviate it as CL. This corpus luteum has many functions in the human reproduction. So, this corpus luteum is maintained for some time by the action of the LH hormone. Now, FSH on the other hand works before this process. It works to stimulate the production of the follicles, maturation of the follicles in the ovary, which lead to the release of the egg. Okay. So, together LH and FSH function in the reproductive maintenance of the reproductive functions of the ovary and the testes in the females and the males respectively. Now, we are still missing some more hormones which are secreted by the actually the intermediate part of the anterior pituitary. This is called as melanocyte stimulating hormone, which acts on melanocytes. What are melanocytes? These are skin cells that produce the pigment. So, the color of your skin is determined by how many melanin containing cells and how much melanin they have in them. So, this is stimulated by MSH, and this regulates the pigmentation of the skin. So, when you need to get more pigmentation, for example, you have been exposed to the sun, the melanocyte stimulating hormone will increase the production of melanin and it will lead to a darkening of your skin color. Then let us talk about the hormones of the posterior pituitary. So, the posterior pituitary has 2 hormones. The first one was oxytocin. So, oxytocin is known to act on the smooth muscles of our body. So, if you are aware, there are 2 kinds of muscles, or rather 3 kinds of muscles in our body. The skeletal muscles, which are present in the limbs and which are required for movement. Then we have smooth muscles, which are lining the internal organs in our body, including the blood vessels and the gut, which are required for the contraction or movement or motility of these of whatever passes through the gut, or in case of blood vessels, it regulates the constriction and relaxation of blood vessels, and the bronchi, which are there in the airways. All of these have smooth muscles. The third kind of muscle is the cardiac muscle, which we have referred to when we talked about the circulatory system. So, anyway, oxytocin acts on these smooth muscles of the body and stimulates their contraction. And this is particularly of importance in certain cases. In females, it stimulates the vigorous contraction of the uterus at the time of childbirth, and it is required for ejection of milk from the mammary gland. So, there also it requires certain muscles to be contracted for ejection of milk from the mammary gland when the baby is suckling. So, this is the function of oxytocin, and then we go to the next one or the last one, which is vasopressin. This, as the name tells you itself, vasopressin regulates the constriction of blood vessels. It is actually acting mainly in the kidney and stimulates the resorption of water and electrolytes by the distal tubules, and thereby reduces the loss of water through the urine. This process of loss of water in the urine is known as diuresis. So, therefore, the other name of vasopressin is antidiuretic hormone or ADH. It prevents the loss of fluid in the urine. So, when you have had a lot of loss of fluid because of other reasons. You have evaporated, you have sweated a lot, or you have lost a lot of water because you had diarrhea and the gut was not able to absorb enough water, then your body needs to conserve water. So, then this vasopressin will come into action and it will concentrate your urine so that you do not lose any additional amount of water in your urine and you are able to conserve the water in the body. So, this is why it is called as antidiuretic hormone. So, with this I am going to finish today's lecture, but before I go it is time for questions. So, what are the questions that I will discuss with you today? So, the first question is, what are the differences between the steroid hormones and the thyroid hormone in terms of their mechanism of action? So, this I have already described to you before. The steroid hormones and the thyroid hormones both are able to enter into the cell, but the receptor is located for the steroid hormone in the cytoplasm, whereas in case of the thyroid hormone it is located inside the nucleus, already bound to the DNA. But in either cases the gene transcription is not active without the presence of the hormone. When the hormone enters, if it is a steroid hormone, it will somehow allow this whole complex to enter into the nucleus. And when it is the thyroid hormone, it straight goes and binds to the nuclear receptor, and this initiates the process of transcriptional activation. So, this receptor hormone complex is now able to transcribe genes that are targets of this hormone system. So, this is the primary difference between the two. Now, the second question is, which part of the endocrine system has neurons that secrete hormones? And this is very easy, which I have already discussed with you. This is the hypothalamus. So, remember, the hypothalamus is made up of specialized kind of neurons which are neurosecretory in nature, meaning they do not just produce neurotransmitters, they also produce certain hormones, and their axons either communicate these hormones and release them into the blood vessel system, or in case of the posterior pituitary, they secrete them directly into the posterior part of the pituitary gland. So, these are the neurons that actually can secrete hormones. The third question is, how do hormones that bind to the membrane receptors regulate the function of the cell? So, these hormones are outside the cell. How are they going to communicate that they are there to the cell inside? So, how do they do this? Is through the following process. They have certain membrane bound receptors. When the hormone comes along, it can bind specifically to these membrane bound receptors. By the way, only in those cells which have the receptors. So, these cells will then be able to receive the signal in terms of the hormone binding to the receptor. But this signal has to be conveyed to the inside of the cell. How is this done? This binding causes a change in the shape of this receptor. Once this receptor is changed, it activates certain other proteins which are associated with it, which will result in the production of certain second messengers. So, the second messenger system is used to communicate the binding of the hormone to the receptor and finally activate more cellular proteins which are actually kinases which can phosphorylate other proteins and activate them further, ultimately mediating the activity or response of the cell to this hormone. Now, what is the hierarchy of action within the endocrine system? I do not know if you notice this because I did not explicitly talk about it, but there is a hierarchy, and this hierarchy begins top down both anatomically and with respect to function. So, the brain, which is the master regulator of everything, has the top boss of this whole system. So, this is the hypothalamus, which releases what is known as releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones. So, these releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones will act on the pituitary, which will cause or regulate the release of pituitary hormones, which are usually called as stimulatory hormones. So, the stimulatory hormones then will act on different endocrine glands, ranging from the thyroid gland to the adrenal gland to the testes and ovaries to the pancreas and so on, and regulate the release of various hormones from there. So, this is the hierarchy that exists in the endocrine system. Now, the last question is, how do you determine if a particular organ or tissue is that target of a particular hormone? So, the way you determine this is by detecting the presence of the receptor first on that organ or tissue. Only if that organ or tissue has the receptor either displayed on the membrane or present within the cytoplasm or nucleus, depending on the kind of hormone, will it be able to be a target for that hormone. Not only this, it also has to respond to the presence of the hormone by activating the signaling cascade downstream, which will ultimately lead to the response or the physiological response that is expected. So, with this we end today's lecture, and thank you all for listening.